what's number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, I would put resiliency beside every number. It is the whole ball game because it really has to do with our future. Not just our environmental future, but our economic future. Is this community going to continue to be sustainable and be able to be the great city that we've been and be able to move forward in the future? And it's all going to be about our ability to manage coastal storm risk in the future and have a plan and a program for accomplishing that. Now, in the last, this is the third forum that I've had the pleasure and privilege of organizing with the GSAC board. And just by way of context and history, in 2023, we focused on water quality issues, red tide, harmful algae blooms, and what that meant and implied for our economy, for public health, and related issues. Last year, we focused in on climate change as it relates to the drivers of climate change, which included looking at sea level rise, warming ocean temperatures and other factors, and also looking at lessons from Hurricane Ian. So today, our focus this year with this program is where are we post Helene and Milton, which is, again, what's on everybody's mind in this room and has been on their mind, I'm sure. And we know that there's been increased frequency of storm events and more intensive storms. We've had this trifecta hit us of property loss, rising insurance rates, and condo inspection requirements that are costing many people a lot of money, and uncertainty about the future, about the condition of our beaches, their sustainability, the economic risks of residing in flood-prone areas. These are just some of the concerns that are on people's minds. So today's forum, we're going to discuss the impacts of Helene and Milton on Naples and vicinity. As Helen said, we're really looking today at a particular focus. You're going to hear a particular focus from some of the panelists on Gulf Shore Boulevard North, Naples Cay to Doctors Pass, and what has been done and is being done in terms of dune protection, revegetation, flood protection, and lessons learned both here and elsewhere in the state who are going through similar issues. And to help us accomplish that, we have a great panel. And what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce all three of them right now. First, we have Brett Moore, who is president and principal engineer of Hummiston and Moore Consulting Coastal Engineers. Brett has founded with Ken Hummiston and Moore in 1991. So this firm has been in existence now for almost 35 years, specializes in coastal engineering design, studies, permitting work, project management. And I would say, you know, there's probably nobody in this business of coastal consulting engineering in the Naples and Collier County area who's better known, more experienced, and better respected than Brett Moore. He's worked for local, state, federal governments. He's worked for private developers, and he is extraordinarily experienced. And the other thing I'll say about Brett is that he never has a shortage of time to dedicate to community and pro bono events, including this one, and just a great contributor to our community. Our second panelist is Chad Washburn, a vice president with the Naples Botanical Gardens. He is vice president of conservation at the Gardens and for the Center of Nature-Based Solutions there. He is responsible for the development of the Gardens' plant conservation strategy and the implementation of that program. He leads their conservation and natural resources team, focusing on projects that ensure the long-term survival of flora and ecosystems in South Florida and the Caribbean region. And like Brett, what I'll say about Chad is that I think many people in this room know him or have encountered him in various ways, but he contributes so much to the community and engages the botanical gardens in this community in a multitude of ways, and is just a great resource for us. Our third speaker is our out-of-town expert. You got to have one of those on any panel, right? Jenna Phillips. Jenna is a coastal engineer and the Senior Director of Engineering for Cummins Cedarburg, a marine and coastal engineering firm where she manages the St. Petersburg and Sarasota offices, responsible for client relations, business development, and strategic growth. She has a bachelor's degree in ocean engineering and a master's degree in coastal engineering, and nearly 20 years of experience specializing in coastal and resiliency planning, coastal engineering, waterfront design for local, state, and federal clients. And I met Jenna at a conference that actually the Conservancy had back late last year, where she was a speaker, and she brought to the table just a wealth of experience working on coastal resilience projects throughout the state of Florida, that some of which she's going to share with you in her presentation today. So the format today will be that each of the speakers, in the order I just introduced them, will come forward and make their presentation. And following that, we'll have a question and answer session. So as you listen to the speakers today, be thinking about any questions you might have, and we're here to answer them as long as you're here to ask them. Before I turn it over to Brett, a few final thoughts that I encourage you to keep in mind about the big picture relating to resiliency. Building the resiliency infrastructure to mitigate coastal flooding risk is enormous in its size, complex, and expensive. It's going to require a lot of political will, leadership, community engagement, good planning, and significant financial resources. The city of Naples is doing a lot, and it can do a lot, but it can't ultimately succeed alone. It's going to require, over time, more city-county cooperation and collaboration, and more state involvement if we're going to move the needle. And more than anything else, in my opinion, we need a plan. A plan our residents can understand and support, and the financial resources to execute that plan. So I make these comments in the hope that you'll all be thinking about them as well, and we can maybe explore that a little bit more also in the question and answer session. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brett. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ray. Good morning, everybody. A lot of the things I'm going to be saying today, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but hopefully, first, I really appreciate being invited to be part of this today, and I hope that you find this the information useful today. If I back off from the podium a little bit and you can't hear me, please let me know. So my outline is pretty simple. It's going to be first talking about coastal vulnerability, and we all know about the recent storms. It'll go back a little bit to Ian, was really the eye-opener, and then the conditions that exist now post-Milton, and then how are we going to build coastal resiliency, and what are the program components we can work with. So, did it automatically? It must be on a timer. So, all right, so the problem is that there was a sense of complacency, throughout the area. So when we really look back over the last 20 years, that we had storms in 2004 and 5, which was two impressive storms, Wilma and Charlie, but they really spared Naples. Then we had over a decade of quiet time and building and everybody getting very complacent about the hurricane season. Can't do that. So things really picked up in 2016 with Hermine, but then Irma. And Irma spared us a lot of problems because the track of the storm wasn't in the water, it was on the mainland. So while it went over top and it created a great deal of wind damage, we were spared a significant hit, which we did get by Ian in 2022 because it was in the water. And the hurricanes from 2022, the 5 storms, up through Milton, were all surge impact storms. They were all in the water following similar tracks, and they pushed water up and created a whole different set of problems. Briefly just going through the storms, we had Ian, which had a storm surge on the order of about plus 8 feet. And when we talk about storm surge, I'm going to try to make it simple. It's just the additional water level that's hitting the shoreline that goes with the tide. So it's 8 feet plus the tide, or 8 feet minus the tide, whatever it might be. And it doesn't include waves, because we also have waves on top of that. Debbie, which everybody just kind of ignores, still had a 3.5-foot surge and still ate away at the dune system. You know, the beach and dune system is what helps dissipate a lot of this energy. It is important. Then came Helene. Helene was very impactful. You know, it had about a 6-foot surge in this area, and you add that to the tide, and that means that another 3 or 4 feet on top of that for waves when this storm is coming across the beach. So that Helene really flattened the beach, flattened the dune, and overtopped the seawalls. And the biggest problem with Helene was it wasn't finished. Milton was like the second half of the storm, 2 weeks later. So we had this smooth runway for Milton to come in, and there really was not anything there to dissipate the energy. So it scoured the near shore and just with fury went inland and carried a lot of sand with it into the inland. So with those storms, we are able to, because there's a very rigorous monitoring program at the county, we have a lot of data. So we looked at the beach profile data I'm going to give you 5 examples. And these profiles they're exaggerated in the vertical scale so you can actually get a sense of how much change there was. And the R references are, there's a monument system that goes from R1 at Lee County down to R89 at Gordon Pass. So this first one is up in Barefoot Beach. And the thing I want you to take a look at, the orange is the erosion. And there's a great deal of erosion in the nearshore area. There's a line that goes across that's dashed. That's basically the water level. So we lost a lot of beach, a lot of nearshore sand, and that giant mound that's to the left side is the sand that was retrieved by the Barefoot Beach community and put back and stockpiled on the beach. And this is an example. This is in front of the Barefoot Beach condominiums. You can just see this large mound of sand that's sitting there totally out of character. That sand was eventually used and spread on the beach under emergency state and federal permits. So now we're jumping down to Naples Cay. That's R45. So it's, obviously just north of the North Park shore, what I refer to it as. And it's a similar pattern, great deal of nearshore erosion. So the beach width is reduced on the order of about 50 feet, but it's a wider beach area because this is part of the beach nourishment area. And then there's a hump up on the left-hand side. That's the sand that was retrieved by the Naples Cay Association and stockpiled back out there. And they did a really good job stockpiling it because it was in a very good dune location and formation. So with that, With the help of the county's program, they've already started vegetating the dune, and we're getting authorization from the city to be able to finish the dune planting. Supposed to start up tomorrow. I spent a few minutes talking about the north end of Park Shore, where you have a dune system that has a very high elevation. It was built in the 1970s, and it has a crest elevation of about 12 and a half feet above, we'll just keep referring to above mean high water. And it's a well-vegetated dune system, and it's been there for 50 years. It's provided a great deal of protection for that area. The dune system was extremely well vegetated. We have a walkway, a promenade on the landward side. It's very, in my mind, very idyllic. And no one ever thought that this would happen. And this is what resulted from Ian. It was just no match. And so Ian just destroyed the dune, crumbled the promenade, and it was truly a disaster for that area. So the Commons TU, V, and W collectively jumped on the restoration of that area, cleaned it up. This is only 3 months after Ian hit, and they already had removed a lot of the debris and brought in on the order of about 20,000 tons of sand. It's like 1,000 truckloads of sand, probably more. And already we're reforming the system and building it back to its original design shape. And that also was able to be done because there were emergency orders issued by the state and also followed by the city that allow for the regulation to just kind of get out of the way, let them go back and do something that really made sense. So this is how that dune system protected that area under Hurricanes Helene and Milton. The other areas that I showed had a great deal of erosion in the near shore because you could just carry that sand and blow right across the top of the dune. But that didn't happen here. So you had much less erosion in the near shore area, and the dune remained intact. That's the dune that was built 18 months after Ian, and it held up. It did very well. So, I mean, there were impacts. There were vegetative impacts and some erosion, but you can see that on this photo, there's no overwash over top of the promenade. It's really in good shape. And in the photograph is part of the truck haul project that's underway to nourish the beach. Then jumping to south of there, where we don't have the promenade up at 12 and a half, it's down at 6. And so the same thing happened again. All that near shore erosion overwashed right into the upland properties. And here's a little bit of a comparison. So in the forefront, we can see the overwashed area. In the background, you can see where the dune program is much higher at 12 and a half, and there wasn't any. So, and then just another shot to bring in Naples, or the south end of Naples. Again, the same problem down there, a lot of near-shore losses. There are a lot of seawalls in that area, but those seawalls are at about the same elevation as the previous slide, which is about 6 feet above mean high water. So, what's our takeaway at this point? I think it's important to see the value of the dune system. It's important to understand, though, that a dune can't exist and be stable without a reasonable sized beach. Otherwise, you'll just have an eroding dune all the time and impacts on turtle habitat, everything. So it's very important that those two go together. They feed each other. The beach provides protection to the dune acts as a reservoir under storms, and will actually put sand back on the beach. So this boring slide is just simply a listing of the computed erosion across, I'm sorry, let me back up because it just jumped in front of me. So this is from R1 at Lee County border down to Gordon Pass. And the area that are shaded are the areas that are within the beach project, the current county beach project, which includes Vanderbilt down through Naples up to about 2 miles north of Gordon Pass. And what we did is take this data and just plotted it. I'm not going to get lost in this slide, although I could. But it does show that there's the area in red is the area that's eroded, that measured, and since Ian, where we had the data, or in the last year. So there's a very consistent, massive amount of loss. And almost 600,000 yards throughout the area, 350,000 yards within the beach project. So, but what's important is that if you look at the bottom of the slide, where it says R22 to R79, that's the beach project area. The sand that came out of that area is part of an ongoing maintenance program. The sand that comes out of the areas adjacent to that, there's nobody feeding those areas and restoring those areas. So as far as the long-term planning, it really would be good for those areas to become part of the beach project. So, and that leads me to the second important part of the program is the beach. Maintaining the beach. The beach is a very significant part of the ability to have something to dissipate that energy when these storms come in. It's not going to do the whole thing, but it's going to help a great deal. These slides, I'm not expecting you to read them at all. The whole purpose of these slides, these next three, are to just show how the beach project has been managed. The beach was built in 1996 with a full operation, and then again in 2006, large-scale hopper dredges pumping sand on the beach. And then from that point onward, the county has been monitoring the beaches every year and then targeting areas that show a need of sand and hitting those with truck haul projects. They're a nuisance, but it's a good way to help manage the ongoing system. In fact, and I've just circled a couple. So we have these bumps here. You have a map of the shoreline for 2006, 13, up to 2023. And in these different time periods, there were different projects. And the same thing for the three main segments. In fact, the ongoing project at Park Shore was already predetermined that it was its time before the storms hit. So that was already in process, was already contracted. Then the storms hit, and then they increased, doubled the amount of sand that they had to put in there. So what I'm trying to profess here is that our first line of protection are the beaches and dunes. They're very significant and they really help a great deal. There's other things we can do, but so in the short term, right after Ian did the berm construction, get some of that sand back into the system, did it quickly. A dune planting program. I know Chad provided a lot of input to the county. The diversity of plants. It was very helpful. It was a great resource. And then there was also funding participation. This Florida legislature came in and had a special session. They appropriated on the order of about $200 million to the affected counties. And then, of course, there's the FEMA programs, and then, of course, the county TDC. So that was like the short term, but the longer term planning here is to keep with the beach system. Perhaps we can add in the other areas to the north and south, and continue with the dune planting program, help maintain that. It really is important. It's not futile, and keep with the ongoing maintenance of the beach. And then anticipate similar, the state is going back to the legislature in March and requesting on the order of another $200 million to help the local governments and municipalities in their funding efforts. So the data that I presented here was provided to the state to be part of that report. And then the other area that's very difficult is the individuals. You know, they got small scale. It's hard for there to be resiliency if only one person tries to do it. However, we talked about the larger scale operations. What do the individuals do? And there's some places where there's just not a lot of room to do anything. So a lot of individuals, condos and property owners are assessing the shore protections they have on site. What's the beach program doing for them? And one of the areas, the south part of Park Shore is looking at down to Horizon Way, is looking to elevate their dune system perhaps to match what works so well just north of them. So the last photo I have here is looking further south of Horizon Way. It's like, well, what are these people supposed to do, right? The beaches are narrower, they have a seawall, their development is closer. There's just not a lot of room. They don't have room to go build a 12-foot dune. But incrementally, you know, they can, and collectively, they can work on perhaps increasing the height of their walls, providing a little more protection from overwash. The sand that is put in Park Shore does work north to south. And when things are good and there is sand in front of their wall, they should plant it up near the wall and just do incrementally what they can. So one last comment. I know I've gone over my 20 minutes, so I apologize for that, but you may wonder why, when they do the nourishment projects, particularly in Park Shore, why aren't they going all the way to the jetty? You know, why are they stopping 1,500 feet north of the jetty? And that's because the sand does generally work its way north to south because of the annual average in energy. If they went all the way to the jetty, the sand would very quickly build out around, and we'd be dredging the inlet more frequently. So there's an advancement expecting that material will eventually fill up on the north side of the jetty. So that's it. Excuse me if I went too long.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming this morning. Thank you to the church and to GSAC for hosting us here. Thank you to our elected officials who are here today leading the way. Sorry, excuse me. And it's great to look around and see so many faces who it really underlines the importance of what we're talking about here today. So I'd like to start at the beginning. I'm going to focus on beach dunes, and then at the end I'll talk about some other resiliency things that we're working on. But starting at the beginning, I'd like to define what is a beach dune, because it's probably not something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, but it is a really vital part of our community's environmental, social, and economic resiliency. In fact, when we visit the beach, quite often we just walk right over the dune and we don't pay much attention to it. But by the end of this presentation, my goal is to change the way you think about beach dunes and its importance to our daily lives. And I want to make all of you advocates for healthy, biodiverse, and resilient beach dunes on our coast. So, a beach dune is a vegetated mound of sand that's formed by wind and wave energy. And they're formed when obstacles, and when I say obstacles, what I really mean there are plants, trap sand and cause it to accumulate and stabilize over time. Beach dunes are one of our planet's most dynamic ecosystems. They change and shift over time and move back and forth on the landscape. And the height and size of the dune is really dependent upon wind and wave energy and the availability of sand. So if you've been to the east coast of the United States, you see these really tall dunes. Well, we don't have as much wind and wave energy and as much sand for that. But our dunes still, even though they're much smaller, they still, as you just heard, play a vital role in protecting our community. They act as a flexible barrier that moves on the landscape, but it's a barrier to waves and storm surge, and that protects the low-lying coastal areas by reducing the potential damage, as you just heard, from flooding and coastal erosion from storm surge. And I always like to joke, mangroves must have the best PR firm out there of all the ecosystems. Everybody knows, when you visit Florida, you hear that mangroves protect our community. But I have to say that beach dunes are just as valuable, if not even more than mangroves, because if you look at a map, where are the beach dunes found? They're found along our coastal community. They're found where our infrastructure is, so they protect that infrastructure. They're our first line of defense against storms. So what happens during a storm? We have waves and surge, high tides that erode sand from the dunes, and they redeposit it offshore in shallow sandbars, or they redeposit it inland or further down the beach. But vegetated dunes provide the protection against erosion and that loss of sand during storms. This is an example. This is a dune on Captiva Island, and it was eroded. This is about 3 foot of erosion during an unnamed storm, but the plants held in place. They prevented flooding in behind this area. This was at the Mucky Duck, if anybody knows this location. The plants are still there. They did their job. This looks like a lot of damage, but these plants, because they are still there, they will be able to recover very quickly in the weeks and months after the storm. And I'll show some images to that here momentarily. So we know that dunes protect our community, but why is restoring our beach dunes such an important thing for our community? They not only protect us, but they form the basis of our economy. In 2024, Collier County welcomed over 2.7 million tourists, just in Collier County alone. And as an industry, those visitors supported over 32,000 jobs and their families along with that. That's our community. And the economic impact of those tourists to the county is over $3.9 billion. And why do people come? If you look at the list of reasons why people come to visit Collier County, the number one reason is to visit our beaches. 50% of the respondents said they come to visit our beaches. I was shocked to learn that I thought golf would have been way up there. Yeah, golf is 7%. So our beach dunes really, a healthy and biodiverse beach dune that can recover quickly after a storm so that our beaches can reopen, that really forms the basis of our economy and helps our community continue to thrive. So we know beach dunes are important. We've talked about that. But they're also have been significantly impacted. They're threatened by a number of things. What are those things that impact them? One of the first ones, hurricanes. I never thought I'd see storms this large and come this quickly. We've seen more intense hurricanes and unnamed storms, and we're likely to see more of that in the future. This past summer, we saw back-to-back storms, and they severely eroded our beaches. These storms are exacerbated by sea level rise. And I don't know if anybody heard, but for the first time this summer in the U.S., we lost a species of plant. It went extinct in the United States due to sea level rise. And that's the Key Largo tree cactus. And as it grows in coastal areas, and as sea level rise, that salt water killed the roots. So it's now extinct in the United States. That happened right here in Florida. Another threat to our coastal ecosystems, invasive species. This is an example, this is a photo of scavola or beach napaca. It is an invasive species, and it can take over the ecosystem. And when it does, it outcompetes all of the biodiversity that we need to make a resilient dune ecosystem. And here's what that looks like when we remove that plant. This was a location where, in collaboration with the city of Naples, we removed that invasive scavola. And historically, in the past, when we restore an area like this, we plant it with just 1 or 2 species, and that's not very effective, unfortunately. But that's what we've done up until fairly recently when we remove exotics. And this is what that looked like. These are sea oats. Typically, we plant sea oats and sea grapes, and that's been our practice of planting. But we know that any healthy and resilient ecosystem relies on plant diversity, relies on biodiversity. And this practice of restoring an ecosystem with just 1 or 2 species limits this dune's ability to not only protect our coast, but also to recover quickly after a storm. And the next few slides will really underline that point. So why do we only plant a couple species? Well, we're relying on what we've done in the past. That's how we've always done it. Those 1 or 2 species are available in the nurseries. We know that they work. But when we do that, we lose the function of all of those other species. So relying on what we've done in the past is not necessarily the best way forward. And even if we did want to include all of this other plant diversity in our plantings, as much as 80% of the species that we need to be planting in our beach dunes are not available in the numbers, in the quantities and qualities that from local nurseries. We need plant material that's collected locally on our beaches so that it's adapted to storms and adapted to our conditions. So we face some incredible challenges in making our beach dunes more resilient. But what can we do as a community to make our beaches more resilient, make our economy more resilient, and all of those people whose jobs rely on tourism? This is a huge challenge. So one of the first steps, we need to identify those workhorse plant species that should be included in beach dune restoration. And there's over 80 species of beach dune plants native to South Florida. Well, we can't go out and collect all of those and grow them. That takes a lot of work. We have limited resources and time. This is an emergency response. So over the past several years, scientists from the Center for Nature-Based Solutions at Naples Botanical Garden, in partnership with our colleagues from Florida Gulf Coast University and Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, have been out doing extensive field work across South Florida to identify those plant species whose function in dune formation, stabilization, and recovery are the ones that we include in beach dune restoration. And a good example of that is sea purslane. This is a little plant that forms a little mat. This is only about 3 inches tall, but we found this plant as a pioneer plant species, meaning it's one of the first plants that we find in the natural process of building a dune. And this may have been one seed or one tiny little piece of plant that landed here, but you can see it has built about a 12-inch dune. This we call an embryonic dune. When it traps that stand and stabilizes it, it also traps windblown seeds of other species coming down the beach. And this is what that looks like when it starts to form an ecosystem. This is at Murdoch Point on Cayo Costa. I don't want to give away too much, but this is one of my favorite fishing spots. This dune formed over about 1 year. Previously, a year before this, there was nothing in this location. So those pioneer species come in. This is sea purslane and seashore paspalum. It's trapping other species. And if we give this enough time, this will form a healthy, biodiverse ecosystem and a stable dune. Some other species perform different functions. This one is bitter panic grass. It's a nice blue color, but this is typically not included in beach dune restorations, but it forms deep roots. It's kind of like the redwoods of the beach dune ecosystem. It's part of a mature plant community, but that helps to hold sand in place. And it's quite a tall plant, but it helps to hold sand in place with those deep roots. Another one of my favorites, I'll talk about this one. You'll see a couple slides of this one. You can tell it's a favorite. In order to determine not only the right species, we have to go out and find out how these species respond to disturbance. How do they recover after a storm? So this is beach elder, and this is one that we planted in collaboration with the city of Naples. And note where that signpost is. After Hurricane Ian, we had storm surge, and it nearly killed this plant. You can see the top of it, the top was killed. However, beach plants are resilient. That resprouted from the base, and you can see, remember that signpost. You can still see where that signpost is. In just a few months, that plant recovered, and it formed about an 18-inch dune, and it spread over quite an area. It's also trapping seeds, and you can see bitter panic grass now growing in this. It's formed its own dune. So dunes can heal. Since then, we found that this plant, beach elder, plays a really significant role in building dunes. During Hurricane Idalia, which was primarily a wind event, I went out the day after the storm, and this is what beach elder looked like. It made a 2-foot-tall dune, and within weeks, this plant will start to recover and grow on top of that dune. That's significant. One more plant that I want to talk about, this plant is railroad vine, and you can't see railroad vine in this picture. Hurricane Idalia passed on August 29th. Well, the 30th, we came out on the beach, first thing in the morning and started taking photos, documenting, collecting data. This photo shows where railroad vine was located. And the next 3 photos, it's the same location, but the camera turns and pans a little bit to the south. This is less than 24 hours after Hurricane Idalia passed. That plant was buried. September 15th, 15 days later, that plant has recovered and is starting to trap sand. 30 days later, that plant has produced flowers, so it's now producing seeds that'll go into the seed bank. That's our future resiliency. And this next slide is a really powerful one. I just overlay an image on this. April 21st, 7 months later. This is one plant, probably a $5 plant, but my two colleagues in this photo are the same height. There's about 2 feet of sand that this plant has trapped, this one $5 plant. That's a really incredible return on investment for just one plant. So why is trapping sand on our beaches so important? And this image tells a part of that story. In April of 2023, we built an emergency sand berm, and you've heard about that this morning, and that was to protect us from storm surge in the event of another hurricane. And that investment paid off. But our community has been addressing coastal resiliency in this way for a number of years. In fact, since 1996, Collier County alone, which is about 20 miles of beaches, we've renourished over 4.2 million cubic yards of sand to our beaches. And renourishment of beach sand, that's a standard practice, and it's one tool in our toolbox for coastal resiliency. However, I think you've seen from the last photos, it needs to be done in conjunction with planting dense plantings of native plant diversity, getting the right plants in. Plants are vital to holding to that sand in place, and they're really a small investment in reducing the time between renourishment of our beaches. So how do we overcome these challenges? We've got a lot of challenges that our community faces, and it impacts nearly everyone in the community, all of our top issues. So first thing we had to do is find a way to make the plant diversity available in the right numbers, the right plants, and scale that up really quickly. So we needed to go out and collect small seeds and cuttings, or small cuttings and seeds of plants from the wild that we've identified as important. Many of these plant species have never been grown in nurseries, so we had to unlock how to grow those. Some of them don't produce seeds, so you have to figure out how to grow them from cuttings. And how do you take 50 cuttings from the wild and make hundreds of thousands of plants? This is something we would have never been able to do without help from our partners. This work was supported by the Collier Community Foundation, who really invested and believed in this and supported this work. And we also collaborated with Rookery Bay and Florida Gulf Coast University to go out and identify and collect these species and figure out how to grow them. And then from there, we can take a small number of plants back to what we call a bulking facility, and we can turn those small number of plants into tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of plants. And this is what this looks like. We plant them out in the ground in rows, and then when we have an emergency situation, when we have a hurricane, we can go collect 100,000 cuttings from these plants and grow them very quickly, almost immediately. We can begin to do that right away. This is the end result. I'm really, really happy to say that the city of Naples and Collier County are doing things the right way. Right now, we're planting nearly 13 miles of beaches with just over 1 million plants going in. And I'm happy to say that for the first time ever, the right plant diversity is going in. All of those species that I mentioned and more are going in. So we have that resiliency, that quick recovery after storms, but we have that protection that our beach dunes offer. And we're moving up the coast. The counties north of us are interested in learning how to do this. But to do this, we're also looking at other coastal ecosystems. What can we do to protect them further inland from disaster? So at the Center for Nature-Based Solutions at Naples Botanical Garden, we're building a seed bank, a restoration seed bank. And in the last 6 months, we've amassed over 500,000 seeds of coastal coastal ecosystem seeds for quick recovery after hurricanes. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and move just inland for a couple slides. As a region, we face a lot of challenges like beach dunes that can be addressed by adapting how we live on the landscape. The infrastructure and development that we have in place today was built for a climate that no longer exists. As our community continues to grow, we need to explore other nature-based solutions to address some of our most pressing problems. So in addition to restoring beach dunes to protect our community, one of the things that we're doing at the Center for Nature-Based Solutions at the Garden is we're building on over a decade and a half of knowledge and experience to improve the design and function of stormwater systems. Stormwater systems were designed primarily to move water off the landscape and reduce flooding. But we know that they can do so much more. So that area that I just showed you, where we were planting, this is what it looks like less than 1 year later. This is a functioning ecosystem. And if you didn't know that we planted it, this would look like you would not know that this is a natural ecosystem. So not only does it function to reduce flooding, it also helps to clean water. And we know that pollutants in water can drive red tide and blue-green algal blooms, other things that impact our community. This is also a great space for local wildlife. And here's what that looks like from a top view. It's incredibly beautiful. And in fact, this site has become a great teaching tool for members of the public, for decision makers, for landscape architects, and for engineers who visit our site. We're also studying the value of protecting coastal lands to reduce the impacts of storm surge and flooding. And we have a 90-acre preserve on the coastal side of our garden. And this area is a destination for some of the 250,000 visitors that come to the garden. And it's also one of the top birding hotspots in Collier County. I believe it's number 2 or number 3. So it's a place for the community. But during Hurricane Milton, this preserve also absorbed nearly 30 million gallons of storm surge, and that destructive wave energy that comes along with that storm surge prevented significant flooding to the surrounding community. So we're studying this site and how water and storm surge moves on the landscape so that we can better understand and better develop parks that can flood, better develop areas that can flood, yet still provide a benefit to our community throughout the year. And finally, as the summer heat index routinely exceeds 100 degrees and coastal landscapes are challenged by saltwater, we're looking at how can we improve landscape practices? How can we bring in regionally appropriate trees that are adapted to a warming climate, that are adapted to saltwater? This is a huge challenge we're going to face. And I want to leave you with one thought. It takes about 10 years to plan, design, permit, fund, and construct a major infrastructure project. That puts us out to 2035. Major infrastructure projects have a lifespan of at least 50 years. So as we plan and build things in our community now, we need to plan and build them to what the conditions might be like as far out as 2085. So as a community, together, all of us can work together to do that and be a more resilient community and continue to thrive. So thank you. And a real quick shout out and thank you to our partners. Thank you.
Good morning, Jenna Phillips. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I'm going to take kind of a combined approach and picking up where both Brett and Chad left off here and talking about resilient shorelines specifically and go over some case studies with you about some coastal management strategies, but kind of shifting around to the Back Bay area and away from the beach side, if you will. So before I jump into that, I want to kind of take a step back and give just a quick overview. Some of you may be familiar with this, but a little bit about what the state has been doing. So back in 2021, Governor DeSantis signed a bill into law that established a new Florida statute, which is statute section 380.093. What that statute did was a couple of different important things here. It established the Resilient Florida program, as well as provided some guidelines to communities, specifically cities and counties initially, to look more at resiliency, really, and to evaluate flood risks and vulnerabilities to our infrastructure. So specifically, it was a call and an incentive plan or program for municipalities and counties to look at the vulnerability of critical assets that are publicly owned and are maintained against the flood hazards associated with high tides, sea level rise, storm surge, rainfall, and the combined effects of those things. In addition to that, since that time, new data is becoming available all of the time. So in 2022, NOAA came out with a technical memorandum with new updated sea level rise projections. And so, as you know, the more data we get as scientists and engineers, we study the data, and IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, updates this information every 5 to 7 years. So they look backwards over the last 5 to 7 years, and then that's why we see these updated projections, which we kind of sometimes tend to interpret as a moving ball, if you will. So through this process with the state's program in 2022, with those updated sea level rise projections, they established and reframed some of the criteria looking at planning horizons out to the year 2050 and 2080, and utilizing those sea level rise projection curves for the intermediate low and intermediate conditions. In addition to that, the Resilient Florida program offers the incentive side of that for communities doing this initiative and undertaking the vulnerability assessment, is that it affords them opportunities to leverage grant funding to support projects and initiatives. So there are a few different grant opportunities, which I'll hit on why these are important here later on in the presentation. But there are a couple of planning grant opportunities which are 100% funded by the state's program, which is an excellent opportunity. The City of Naples has taken advantage of that and have already paved the way in completing a vulnerability assessment. It also offers opportunities to conduct feasibility studies that include things like planning, design, and permitting for nature-based solutions, and specifically for shoreline projects that are designed to reduce the impacts of sea level rise. And of course, implementation grants, which are more for construction purposes. Shortly thereafter, this bill came signed into law. The state also came out with a statewide critical asset inventory. So the way they define critical assets is throughout these 4 overarching categories of transportation, critical infrastructure, critical community emergency facilities, and natural, cultural, and historic resources. So for today's purposes, I'm going to focus on that 4th category. And those sub-bullets underneath of item 4 are the specific things that are included within that asset category for evaluation of flood risks. And those include conservation lands and parks, shorelines, surface waters, and historic, cultural assets. So for today, we're going to focus specifically on shorelines. And so the important thing to pull from all of this background is that shorelines are seen by the state of Florida as a critical asset, right? So we've been spending a lot of time talking about that today. And not only that, but it's really the link to additional funding opportunities for projects that really help to move the needle in terms of resiliency. So this Florida statewide resilience data set really leaned into the use of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's Environmental Sensitivity Index to define shoreline locations and classify shoreline types. And so this next slide on the table on the right is just a quick export summarizing all the different shoreline types that they mapped statewide. So you can see there's quite an array of shoreline classification types here. That graphic on the upper left-hand side, you can see the distribution of those. So quite a bit of marsh, swamps, and wetlands as we might expect, right? And then the breakdown of the man-made types of shorelines as well as your sandy beaches. So honing in here for the City of Naples in particular, this is kind of a quick snapshot. You can see this is a GIS layer map on the right-hand side that delineates all of your shorelines, both on the beaches side, and then the yellow is the back bay areas with some green. So you've got a combination of hardened or man-made shorelines along the back bay as well as some natural areas. Along those regions, this is kind of the typical scenario we see most often, right, is seawalls. So back in the 50s and 60s, we did a lot of dredging and filling, and in order to hold that fill in place, we leaned into a lot of the traditional approaches for shoreline stabilization, such as seawalls and bulkheads. And those were great for providing wave attenuation, shoreline erosion and stabilization, reducing the effects of tidal and storm surge flooding. It's oftentimes easy to permit. There's some easy button, if you will, state permitting solutions. Now that the contractors have been familiar with installation of these systems, it's pretty easy to install, relatively low maintenance, but there are some downsides, especially as we take that step back and look at things through the lens of resiliency. No question, we're seeing where they're expensive to maintain. If your seawall is reaching its service life, if you will, and due for replacement, there's quite a big cost to bear there on the front end. But it also has some negative impacts to your downdrift neighbors, such as reflecting of wave energy, causing scour at the base of the wall, which can destabilize the structure overall. Sometimes it can be unattractive, particularly in the example you see here in the center of the slide, where we've had an overtopped condition and now it's holding water and collecting all kinds of debris. So in looking at resiliency and shorelines combined, we know that our future is going to continue to have some wet and stormy periods, and we need to kind of think and do better and think ahead a little bit more. So it's that balance of shoreline stabilization with resilience while adding ecological benefits and still providing that access, right? We want to still have access to the water. So that figure here on the bottom you may be familiar with, and it's important to just kind of hit on the fact that we're really looking now at a wide range of solutions, moving away from that fully gray solution into more hybrid that you see in the center here, which we'll go over a few case studies, or if the site conditions allow a more fully traditional green approach. So this is just a quick snapshot of some instances where you may have space limited. These are 3D printed panels that are a nice option for if you have a seawall, maybe you're right along a navigational channel, there's really not a lot of space to do much more. We have seen other estuary programs also really interested in these types of projects, particularly where there's vinyl walls in place. So the concept of microplastics and things like this provides a little bit of an ecological enhancement to dampen some of those effects. So these are a nice solution. Other examples of living shorelines kind of moving to the other end of the spectrum you're probably familiar with are a lot of marshy areas, oyster restoration, the combination of rock and vegetated sills. So these are really nice projects where space is available. Sometimes, such as in Naples and other parts of Florida, space is a very hot commodity, if you will, right? So it's difficult to find the space for that. So as you move into selecting a site and what might be appropriate for various site conditions, these are some of the design parameters that as coastal engineers we look at, such as what's the potential for wave loads and overtopping, what types of scour or current-induced scour do we need to consider, as well as storm surge and hydraulic stability. So this photo kind of pulls all of those things together and just kind of some guidance for identifying and selecting appropriate sites for whether or not your property or your area or your park open space may have the opportunities to provide for these projects. So upland space is a big component. We'll talk about that here more in a bit. The length of shoreline is also a major consideration, but more so you want to think about your open fetch, which Brett mentioned earlier. Is it an open coast condition where you have that runway effect for storm surge and waves, or is it more of an enclosed area? And so in both of the photos you see here, on the bottom right, this is more of an open fetch scenario, open coast condition, maybe not as suitable for a natural stabilization. So in moving into planning of a project, one of the first things we always look at is the state regulations. And so both the state and the feds have easy button permit opportunities, if you will, but I'm just focusing here to start with DEP. For natural or nature-based shoreline solutions, there are some exemptions that are available on the left-hand side here, but there's some very specific guidelines associated with those, and that includes, of course, it must be mostly native wetland plants. They want you to use natural materials such as rock or oyster reefs. There's a limitation to how far waterward you can build, so generally they don't allow you to go more than 10 feet beyond your mean high water line. If you're replacing a seawall, the water line, that mean high water line is at your wall. And it also limits you to 500 feet along the shore with some very limited use of fill. On the other side of things, there are general permits that also allow you to build oyster reefs and things of that nature. But overall, pretty limited, right? Especially when we have this major undertaking, this resiliency that we're looking towards in the future, we want to think bigger on a larger platform here. On the policy side of things, just kind of painting a picture here, the state has a preference, as you can see from the guidelines, for building in the upland side. Most of the work we do that fits those easy button permit options are above the mean high water line, which is a regulatory line. Once you go waterward of that mean high water line, then you're pulling in the Army Corps of Engineers, and there's a more detailed permit processing review established there. However, we're working with a lot of local municipalities, local governments, and oftentimes park spaces or conservation lands become ripe for the picking for these kind of pilot type projects. And we're looking at different types of shorelines like street ends and easements to incorporate some of these living shoreline projects. However, a lot of times there are local policies that allow no net loss of public land on the upland side. So you're starting to see where we end up with this different term or different variation of coastal squeeze, where you're really limited with how far waterward you can move and limited with how far landward you can move. It kind of keeps us in this box. So we've started to have some really hard conversations with the state and federal regulatory agencies about what can we do to really improve this process and open up the box, if you will, so that we can think bigger and tackle these resiliency challenges that we're seeing. And so I'm just going to cover a few case studies with you where we've started to do that throughout the state of Florida. The first one here as an example is Dinner Key. This is a project in the city of Miami. This marina is just over 600 slips. It's one of the largest in the state and was completely devastated in 2017 with Hurricane Irma. The city received FEMA funding to go in and replace the marina as part of a phase 1 project, and then subsequently to go in and evaluate these different existing spoil islands that you see here in the image. Most of these spoil islands are relatively low in elevation and, of course, experience quite a bit of erosion and destabilization as a result of those storms. But no question, you can see there's quite a lot going on here. This is a very active marina, lots of boats and vessel traffic in and out, right in front of that downtown core of Miami. So the low-lying islands combined with the king tide elevations that area experiences on the order of just over 2 feet. As you can see, there's quite a bit of inundation that happens regularly in these spoil islands, which are really intended to be the first line of defense for this marina and ultimately the downtown waterfront area. So in addition to that, we did quite an extensive look at marine resources, so identifying seagrasses and mangroves within the area, and also identifying opportunities to remove any invasive vegetation. And what this next slide shows is just kind of a sampling of the conceptual design options that we're looking at to help stabilize and rehabilitate these islands in order to provide that 100-year storm surge protection for the marina and the downtown area. So working with the agencies hand in hand, we've kind of had to strike this very fine balance over impacts to seagrasses, which is usually a non-starter conversation, and mangroves, but getting them to kind of work with us to see the bigger picture about how we're going to not only maybe an impact over here, but ultimately an overall enhancement and benefit to the project and to the area. Another example, just kind of sliding a little bit further to the east, is for the city of Miami Beach, where we performed a living shoreline suitability index. In this instance, we looked at over 118 different publicly owned shoreline segments throughout the city. And the reason for that was to identify suitability criteria for natural or nature-based hybrid types of solutions. Some of that criteria is listed here, which we touched on already. What's the length of the shoreline? What's the elevation? What's the functionality of that shoreline? Or what is it supporting on the upland side, for example? The water depths and, of course, wave exposure. So we populated all this data into a GIS database and then worked with the city to identify and narrow that down to really 10 priority projects to start with. And this is just one of the examples I'll touch on here. This is a segment of shoreline that we identified that was about 600 feet long. As you can see, pretty devoid of anything. It's fronting on the water side a navigation channel, and on the upland side an emergency evacuation route. But other than the wall, there's not a lot of environmental benefits here. So we felt like this was a great opportunity to kind of look at some other alternatives to provide further protection to the upland road and provide that biodiversity. So what this is a rendering of that solution now that we're moving through the process of design and permitting, but looking to kind of expand into the water. Of course, this is much further than the 10-foot minimum that the current exemption criteria allows. So what that means is that all other permits get kicked into what's called an individual permit, which is a bit of a more rigorous review process by the state. But this project will incorporate a series of natural materials such as rock, vegetation. We're also providing a boardwalk access here for some access to the water, which currently from the wall there's not a lot of activation with the waterfront. This project also will meet certain criteria for storm surge and taking into consideration sea level rise. So this has been a great example of an opportunity where we've identified in a shoreline segment that we could do more, right, improve that resiliency for the road. Staying in the Miami area here, another project that we've been working on with the city is Jose Marti Park, which is right around Little Havana. This is along the Miami River, so there's a federal navigation channel there on the water side. If you're familiar with the area, the water quality in that river is not really what we see over here. It's not swimming conditions, we might say. So not a lot of resources that we had to contend with, which was a positive when it came to designing some conceptual options and solutions. On the upland side, they were experiencing routine flooding associated with king tides quite often, so the elevations were really low there. So we came in with a multi-phased approach here, looking at both the tidal conditions as well as sea level rise out to 2050, 2080, and 2100. So this is just a cross-section of one of the solutions that we've provided. This project has gone all the way through both design and permitting, and we're getting ready to start construction here. But from this, you can see we still have some rock there as kind of a hardened still edge with some layered approach at different elevations for appropriate vegetation and planting to stabilize that shoreline. On the next slide, you can see where we've incorporated a floating dock to allow access from the park on the upland side to the water so folks can still get around and have that view shed, if you will, without being impacted or fully impeded by the natural vegetation there. Moving up the coast a little bit, we also have worked with the city of West Palm Beach doing some similar projects for them along Curry Park. In this instance, as I mentioned earlier, there's some funding opportunities for these living shoreline and hybrid type solutions, which is a really great thing. So what we've been able to do is work with the city in this case and others to really leverage really finite resources that you may have, maybe as part of a existing funds that you have, and find opportunities to leverage and optimize those funds. So in this case, we were able to get the city just under $24 million through a combination of all these different agencies to support this project. This is another one that's getting ready to start construction here now. But the scope of that project in the upper left, you can see the existing conditions. Again, another existing seawall. They did have some mangrove planters there with kind of a rock sill around the edge, those 3 areas you see there. Those mangroves were pretty mature, and throughout the design process, we were really interested in relocating those, disassembling the rock planters, but maintaining those mangroves and just relocating and just redistributing them. And you wouldn't have expected it, but it was quite a back and forth with the agencies because they're looking at things through such a narrow lens that it really was a lot of engagement and meetings and FaceTime to get them to understand that we weren't impacting, we were redistributing, right? We were wanting to maintain these. So encourage you to kind of be willing to push back, get them to come around to the idea of these bigger picture concepts that you have, and don't be afraid to have those hard conversations. So this project was really a great, the rendering here on the bottom is what that project will look like here. Again, incorporating some green and gray approaches. And then the last project example I'll leave you here with is over on the Gulf Coast, a little bit closer to me in Manatee County. This is a park project that's owned and maintained by the county in Puerto Sueño Park. This area connects to the Palmasola Bay, which connects to Tampa Bay, if you're familiar with the area. On the bottom left, you can see kind of the existing site conditions. On the northern half of that shoreline is an old deteriorating bulkhead that's from the 1960s era. And because it's pretty well enclosed within that basin, there are some, there's a marina to the south on the shoreline, but outside of vessel traffic, it's pretty low energy. So we felt like this was a great opportunity to kind of remove that existing wall, which is about +3. So this community was already experiencing a great deal of overtopping during storm conditions anyway, and actually raise the berm to some extent to provide more protection for the road and create a more sloped stabilization. So that rendering on the bottom, the right-hand side, both of these in plan view and cross-section is the preliminary design concept currently, and this project is in the permit process as we speak. So overall, just to leave you with a few takeaways, when thinking about shorelines, thinking bigger than just seawalls, particularly on the back bays, and try to capitalize as much as possible those funding opportunities that are available. There's quite a lot of encouragement from the state and federal programs to support these types of projects, and so it's good to be aware of those. One of the things to be sure about when you're going into these planning of a project is to have your goals clearly defined, as well as establishing of the co-benefits, because that's really what's going to carry you through those challenging regulatory conversations, so that you can kind of get that buy-in from the agencies. It is good to note, though, that through the process of these different projects, we've been working with the state regulators to move towards new rulemaking where they're going to be expanding some of those exemption criteria as I showed you. So they're reevaluating the ability to go more waterward than the 10 feet that's currently mandated, and looking at longer stretches of shoreline as well. So stay on the lookout for some changes in the positive direction there. Other considerations, of course, to identify competing constraints, taking into consideration upland space available with the resources and impacts on the water side. And then, as Chad mentioned, always being sure that we are looking to the future, right? When we're planning these projects, that we're looking at water levels out to the 2050, 2080, and beyond, so that we can keep those aligned with our design life criteria for a typical project. So, in summary, just be sure to be creative. Don't think inside the box or back yourself into the box of those easy button permit criterias, although I know that's been a challenge to balance with grant funding timelines and the need for emergency restoration. So it's good to have these conversations. I'm glad to see that the state and the feds are having the conversations, and we need to keep having them and reaching out to your local officials. So appreciate your time. Thank you.